Billy the Kid.
William H Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid and also known as Henry Antrim, was a 19th-century Irish-American gunman who participated in the Lincoln County War and became a frontier outlaw in the American Old West. According to legend, he killed 21 men, but it is generally believed that he killed 8 people. He killed his first man in 1877 at the age of 18. McCarty, or Bonney, the name he used at the height of his notoriety, was 5'8" inches, 173 centimeters, tall with blue eyes, blonde hair or dirty blonde hair, and a smooth complexion. He was described as being friendly and personable at times, and as lithe as a cat. Contemporaries described him as a neat dresser who favored an unadorned Mexican sombrero. These qualities, along with his cunning and celebrated skill with firearms, contributed to his paradoxical image as both a notorious outlaw and a folk hero. Billy was relatively unknown during most of his lifetime but was catapulted into legend in 1881 when New Mexico's governor, Lew Wallace, placed a price on his head. In addition, the Las Vegas Gazette, Las Vegas, New Mexico, and the New York Sun carried stories about his exploits. Other newspapers followed suit. Several biographies written about Billy the Kid after his death portrayed him in varying lights.
Early life.
William Henry McCarty, Jr. is believed by Michael Wallace and Robert M. Utley, scholars of Western history, to have been born 2 days before the Civil War in an Irish neighborhood in New York City, at 70 Allen Street. His birthplace remains in question as there are no records that prove that he ever lived there. Born to Irish immigrants, it is uncertain who his biological father was. Some researchers have theorized that his name was Patrick McCarty, Michael McCarty, William McCarty, or Edward McCarty. His mother's name was Catherine McCarty, although there have been continuing debates about whether McCarty was her maiden or married name. She is believed to have emigrated to New York during the time of the Great Famine. In 1868, Catherine McCarty had moved with her 2 young sons, William and Joseph, to Indianapolis, Indiana. There she met William Antrim, who was 12 years her junior. In 1873, after several years of moving around the country, the two were married at the First Presbyterian Church in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and settled further south in Silver City. Antrim found work as a bartender and carpenter, but then became involved in prospecting and gambling as a way to make a living, and during that period spent very little time at home with his wife and stepsons. Young William McCarty did not often use the surname Antrim. McCarty's mother reportedly washed clothes, baked pies, and took in boarders in order to provide for herself and her sons. Boarders and neighbors remembered her as a jolly Irish lady, full of life and mischief, but she was already in the final stages of tuberculosis when the family reached Silver City. On September 16, 1874, Catherine McCarty died. She was buried in the Memory Lane Cemetery in Silver City. At the age of 14, McCarty was taken in by a neighboring family who operated a hotel. He worked there to pay for his keep. The manager was impressed by the youth, contending that he was the only young man who ever worked for him who did not steal anything. One of McCarty's schoolteachers later recalled that the young orphan was no more of a problem than any of the other boys and that he was always quite willing to help with chores around the schoolhouse. Biographers sought to explain McCarty's subsequent descent into lawlessness by focusing on his habit of reading dime novels that romanticized crime. Another explanation was that his slender physique placed him in precarious situations with bigger and stronger boys. He was forced to seek new lodgings when his foster family began to experience domestic problems. McCarty moved into a boarding house and pursued odd jobs. In April 1875, McCarty was arrested by Grant County Sheriff Harvey Whitehill for stealing cheese. McCarty was arrested again on September 24, 1875 when he was found in possession of clothing and firearms that a fellow boarder had stolen from a Chinese laundry owner. 2 days after McCarty was placed in jail, the teenager escaped up the jailhouse chimney. From that point on McCarty was a fugitive more or less. According to some accounts, McCarty eventually found work as an itinerant ranch hand and shepherd in southeastern Arizona. In 1876 McCarty settled in the vicinity of the Fort Grant Army Post in Arizona, where he worked on ranches and tested his skills at local gaming houses. Sheriff Whitehill would later say that he liked the boy, and his acts of theft were more due to necessity than wantonness. During this time, McCarty became acquainted with John O'Mackie, a Scottish-born ex-cavalry private with a criminal bent. The two men supposedly became involved in the risky, but profitable, enterprise of horse thievery. McCarty, who stole from local soldiers, became known by the name of Kid Antrim. Biographer Robert M. Utley writes that the nickname arose because of McCarty's slight build and beardless countenance, his young years, and his appealing personality. In 1877 McCarty was involved in a conflict with a civilian blacksmith at Fort Grant, an Irish immigrant named Frank P. Windy Cahill, who took pleasure in bullying the young McCarty. On August 17, Cahill reportedly attacked McCarty after a verbal exchange and threw him to the ground. Reliable accounts say that McCarty retaliated by shooting Cahill, who died the next day. The coroner's inquest concluded that McCarty's shooting of Cahill was criminal and unjustifiable. Some of those who witnessed the incident later claimed that McCarty acted in self-defense. Years later, Louis Abraham, who had known McCarty in Silver City but was not a witness, denied that anyone was killed in the altercation. In fear of Cahill's friends, McCarty fled the Arizona Territory and entered into New Mexico Territory. He eventually arrived at the former Army post of Apache Tejo, where he joined a band of cattle rustlers who raided the sprawling herds of cattle magnate John Kysom. During this period McCarty was spotted by a resident of Silver City, and the teenager's involvement with the notorious gang was mentioned in a local newspaper. McCarty rode for a time with the gang of rustlers known as the Jesse Evans Gang, but then turned up at Haskell Jones's house in Pecos Valley, New Mexico. According to this account, Apaches stole McCarty's horse, forcing him to walk many miles to the nearest settlement, which happened to be Jones's home. When he arrived, the young man was supposedly near death, but Mrs. Jones nursed him back to health. The Jones family developed a strong attachment to McCarty and gave him one of their horses. At some point in 1877, McCarty began to refer to himself as William H. Bonney.
Lincoln County War.
In 1877, McCarty, now widely known as William Bonney, moved to Lincoln County, New Mexico, and was hired by Doc Scurlock and Charlie Boda to work in their cheese factory. Through them he met Frank Coe, George Coe and Ab Saunders, three cousins who owned their own ranch near the ranch of Richard M. Brewer. After a short stint working on the ranch of Henry Hooker, McCarty began working on the Coe-Saunders ranch. Late in 1877, McCarty, along with Brewer, Boda, Scurlock, the Coes and Saunders, was hired as a cattle guard by John Tunstall, an English cattle rancher, banker and merchant, and his partner, Alexander Maxween, a prominent lawyer. A conflict known today as the Lincoln County War had erupted between the established town merchants, Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, and competing business interests headed by Tunstall and Maxween. Before the arrival of Tunstall and Maxween, Murphy and Dolan presided over a monopoly of Lincoln County's cattle and merchant trade. Their far-reaching operation was known locally as the House, after a large mansion in Lincoln that served as Murphy and Dolan's headquarters. There was also an ethnic element to the House's conflict with Tunstall. Murphy and Dolan, both Irish immigrants, were strongly opposed to an Englishman like Tunstall cutting into their business. Events turned bloody on February 18, 1878, when Tunstall was spotted while driving a herd of 9 horses towards Lincoln and murdered by William Morton, Jesse Evans, Tom Hill, Frank Baker and Sheriff William J. Brady of Lincoln County, all members of a posse serving the House, sent to attack Maxween's holdings. After murdering Tunstall, the gunmen shot down his prized bay horse. As a rhymed macabre joke on Tunstall's great affection for horses, the dead bay's head was then pillowed on his hat, writes Frederick Nolan, Tunstall's biographer. Although members of the House sought to frame Tunstall's death as a justifiable homicide, evidence at the scene suggested that Tunstall attempted to avoid a confrontation before he was shot down. Tunstall's murder enraged McCarty and the other ranch hands. Maxween, who abhorred violence, took steps to punish Tunstall's murderers through legal means. He obtained warrants for their arrests from the local justice of the peace, John B. Wilson. Tunstall's men formed their own group called the Regulators. After being deputized by Brewer, Tunstall's foreman, who had been appointed a special constable and given the warrant to arrest Tunstall's killers, proceeded to the Murphy-Dolan store. The wanted men, Bill Morton and Frank Baker, attempted to flee, but they were captured on March 6. Upon returning to Lincoln, the Regulators reported that Morton and Baker had been shot on March 9 near Agua Negra during an alleged escape attempt. During their journey to Lincoln, the Regulators killed one of their members, a man named McCloskey, whom they suspected of being a traitor. On the day that McCloskey, Morton, and Baker were slain, Governor Samuel Beach Axtell arrived in Lincoln County to investigate the ongoing violence. The governor, accompanied by James Dolan and associate John Riley, proved hostile to the faction now headed by Maxween. The Regulators went from lawmen to outlaws. Axtell refused to acknowledge the so-called Santa Fe Ring, a group of corrupt politicians and business leaders led by U.S. Attorney Thomas Benton Catron. Catron cooperated closely with the House, which was perceived as part of the notorious Ring. The Regulators planned to settle a score with Sheriff William J. Brady, who had arrested McCarty and fellow Deputy Fred Waite in the aftermath of Tunstall's murder. At the time Brady arrested them, the two men were trying to serve a warrant on him for his suspected role in looting Tunstall's store after the Englishman's death, as well as against his posse members for the murder of Tunstall. On April 1, the Regulators Jim French, Frank McNabb, John Middleton, Frederick Waite, Henry Brown and McCarty Bonney ambushed Sheriff Brady and his deputy, George W. Hindman, killing them both in Lincoln's Main Street. McCarty was shot in the thigh while attempting to retrieve a rifle that Brady had seized from him during an earlier arrest. With this move, the Regulators disillusioned many former supporters, who came to view both sides as equally nefarious and bloodthirsty. The connection between Maxween and the Regulators was ambiguous, however. McCarty was loyal to the memory of Tunstall, though not necessarily to Maxween. Jacobson doubts whether McCarty and Maxween were acquainted at the time of Brady's death. According to a contemporary newspaper account, the Regulators disclaimed all connection or sympathy with Maxween and his affairs, and expressed their sole desire was to track down Tunstall's murderers. On April 4, in what became known as the gunfight of Blazers Mills, the Regulators sought the arrest of Buckshot Roberts, a former buffalo hunter whom they suspected of involvement in the Tunstall murder. Roberts refused to be taken alive, although he suffered a severe bullet wound to the chest. During the gun battle, he shot and killed the Regulators' leader, Dick Brewer. 4 other Regulators were wounded in the skirmish. The incident had the effect of further alienating the public, as many local residents admired the way Roberts put up a gutsy fight against overwhelming odds.
Killing of Frank McNabb and after.
After Brewer's death, the Regulators elected Frank McNabb as captain. For a short period, the Regulators benefited from the appointment of Sheriff John Copeland, who proved sympathetic to their cause. Copeland's authority was undermined by the House, which recruited members from among Brady's former deputies. On April 29, 1878, a posse including the Jesse Evans Gang and the Seven Rivers Warriors, under the direction of former Brady deputy George W. Pepin, engaged McNabb, Ab Saunders and Frank Coe in a shootout at the Fritz Ranch. They killed McNabb, severely wounded Saunders and captured Coe. Coe escaped custody a short time later. Your next day the Regulators ironclad took up defensive positions in the town of Lincoln, where they traded shots with Dolan's men as well as U.S. cavalrymen. The only casualty was Dutch Charlie Kruling, a house gunman wounded by a rifle slug fired by George Coe. By shooting at U.S. government troops, the Regulators gained a new set of enemies. On May 15, the Regulators tracked down Seven Rivers Warriors gang member Manuel Segovia, the suspected murderer of Frank McNabb, and killed him. Around the time of Segovia's death, the Regulator ironclad gained a new member, a young Texas cowpoke named Tom Affiliate, who became McCarty's close friend and constant companion. The regulators' position worsened when the governor, in a quasi-legal move, removed Copeland and appointed House ally George Pepin as sheriff. Under indictment for the Brady killing, McCarty and the other regulators spent the next several months in hiding and were trapped, along with McSween, in McSween's home in Lincoln on July 15, by members of the House and some of Brady's men. On July 19, a column of U.S. cavalry soldiers entered the fray. Although the soldiers were ostensibly neutral, their actions favored the Dolan faction. After a 5-day siege, the posse set McSween's house on fire. McCarty and the other regulators fled. The posse shot McSween when he escaped the fire, essentially marking the end of the Lincoln County War.
Lew Wallace and amnesty.
In the autumn of 1878, the President appointed Lew Wallace, a former Union Army general, as governor of the New Mexico Territory. In an effort to restore peace to Lincoln County, Wallace proclaimed an amnesty for any man involved in the Lincoln County War who was not already under indictment. McCarty, who had fled to Texas after his escape from McSween's house, was under indictment, but sent Wallace a letter requesting immunity in return for testifying in front of the grand jury. In March 1879, Wallace and McCarty met in Lincoln County to discuss the possibility of a deal. McCarty greeted the governor with a revolver in one hand and a Winchester rifle in the other. After taking several days to consider Wallace's offer, McCarty agreed to testify in return for amnesty. The arrangement called for McCarty to submit to a token arrest and a short stay in jail until the conclusion of his courtroom testimony. Although McCarty's testimony helped to indict John Dolan, the district attorney, one of the powerful House faction leaders, disregarded Wallace's order to set McCarty free after his testimony. After the Dolan trial, McCarty and Affiliate escaped on horses supplied by friends. For the next year and a half, McCarty survived by rustling, gambling, and taking defensive action. In January 1880, he reportedly killed a man named Joe Grant in a Fort Sumner saloon. Grant, who did not realize who his opponent was, boasted that he would kill Billy the Kid if he ever encountered him. In those days people loaded their revolvers with only 5 rounds, with the hammer down on an empty chamber. This was done to prevent an accidental discharge should the hammer be struck. The Kid asked Grant if he could see his ivory-handled revolver and, while looking at the weapon, rotated the cylinder so the hammer would fall on the empty chamber when the trigger was pulled. He told Grant his identity. When Grant fired, nothing happened, and McCarty shot him. When asked about the incident later, he remarked, "It was a game for 2, and I got there first." Other versions of this story exist. One biographer, Joel Jacobson, recounts the story as described in Utley, describing Grant as a drunk, who was making himself obnoxious in a bar. The Kid is described as rotating the cylinder so an empty chamber was beneath the hammer. In Jacobson's recounting of the incident, Grant tried to shoot McCarty in the back. As was leaving the saloon, his back turned to Grant, he heard a distinct click. He spun around before Grant could reach a loaded chamber. Always a good marksman, he shot Grant in the chin. In November 1880, a posse pursued and trapped McCarty's gang inside a ranch house owned by his friend James Greathouse at Anton Chico in the White Oaks area. James Carlisle of the posse entered the house under a white flag, in an effort to negotiate the group's surrender. Greathouse was sent out to act as a hostage for the posse. At some point in the evening, Carlisle evidently decided the outlaws were stalling. According to one version, Carlisle heard a shot that had been fired accidentally outside. Concluding that the posse had shot down Greathouse, he chose escape, crashed through a window and was fired upon and killed. Recognizing their mistake, the posse became demoralized and scattered, enabling McCarty and his gang to slip away. McCarty vehemently denied shooting Carlisle, and later wrote to Governor Wallace, claiming to be innocent of this crime and others attributed to him.
Pat Garrett.
During this time, McCarty became acquainted with an ambitious local bartender and former buffalo hunter named Pat Garrett. While popular accounts often depict McCarty and Garrett as bosom buddies, there is no evidence that they were friends. Running on a pledge to rid the area of rustlers, Garrett was elected as sheriff of Lincoln County in November 1880. In early December, he assembled a posse and set out to arrest McCarty, at that time known almost exclusively as Billy the Kid. The Kid then carried a $500 bounty on his head that had been authorized by Governor Lew Wallace. The posse led by Garrett fared well, and his men closed in quickly. On December 19 McCarty barely escaped a midnight ambush in Fort Sumner, which left one member of the gang, Tom Affiliate, dead. On December 23 the Kid was tracked to an abandoned stone building located in a remote location known as Stinking Springs, near present-day Tebon, New Mexico. While McCarty and his gang were asleep inside, Garrett's posse surrounded the building and waited for sunrise. The next morning a cattle rustler, named Charlie Boda, stepped outside to feed his horse. Mistaken for McCarty, he was shot down by the posse. Soon afterwards, somebody from within the building reached for the horse's halter rope, but Garrett shot and killed the horse, whose body blocked the building's only exit. As the lawmen began to cook breakfast over an open fire, Garrett and McCarty engaged in a friendly exchange, with Garrett inviting McCarty outside to eat, and McCarty inviting Garrett to go to hell. Realizing that they had no hope of escape, the besieged and hungry outlaws finally surrendered and were allowed to join in the meal.
Escape from Lincoln.
McCarty was transported from Fort Sumner to Las Vegas, where he gave an interview to a reporter from the Las Vegas Gazette. Next, the prisoner was transferred to Santa Fe, where he sent 4 separate letters over the next 3 months to Governor Wallace seeking clemency. Wallace, however, refused to intervene, and the Kid's trial was held in April 1881 in Missoula. On April 9, after 2 days of testimony, McCarty was found guilty of the murder of Sheriff Brady, the only conviction ever secured against any of the combatants in the Lincoln County War. On April 13, he was sentenced by Judge Warren Bristol to hang. With his execution scheduled for May 13, McCarty was removed to Lincoln, where he was held under guard by 2 of Garrett's deputies, James Bell and Robert Ollinger, on the top floor of the town courthouse. On April 28, while Garrett was out of town, McCarty stunned the territory by killing both of his guards and escaping. The details of the escape are unclear. Some researchers believe that a sympathizer placed a revolver in a nearby privy that McCarty was permitted to use, under escort, each day. McCarty retrieved the gun, and turned it on Bell when the pair had reached the top of a flight of stairs in the courthouse. Another theory holds that McCarty slipped off his manacles at the top of the stairs, struck Bell over the head with them, grabbed Bell's own gun, and shot him with it. Bell staggered down the stairs, dying as he fell. McCarty scooped up Ollinger's 10-gauge double-barrel shotgun. Both barrels had been fully loaded with buckshot earlier by Ollinger himself. The Kid waited at the upstairs window for his second guard, who had been across the street with some other prisoners, to respond to the gunshot and come to Bell's aid. As Ollinger came running into view, McCarty leveled the shotgun at him, called out "Hello Bob," and killed him. The Kid's escape was delayed for an hour while he worked free of his leg irons with a pickaxe, and then the young outlaw mounted a horse and rode out of town, reportedly singing. The horse returned 2 days later.
Death.
Sheriff Pat Garrett responded to rumors that McCarty was lurking in the vicinity of Fort Sumner almost 3 months after his escape. Garrett and 2 deputies set out on July 14, 1881, to question one of the town's residents, a friend of McCarty's named Pete Maxwell, son of the land baron Lucien Maxwell. Close to midnight, as Garrett and Maxwell sat talking in Maxwell's darkened bedroom, McCarty unexpectedly entered the room. There are at least 2 versions of what happened next. One version suggests that, as the Kid entered, he failed to recognize Garrett in the poor light. McCarty drew his revolver and backed away, asking, "Quiénes? Quiénes?" Spanish for, "Who is it? Who is it?" Recognizing McCarty's voice, Garrett drew his own revolver and fired twice, the first bullet striking McCarty in the chest just above his heart, although the second one missed and struck the mantel behind him. McCarty fell to the floor, gasped for a minute and died. In the second version, McCarty entered carrying a knife, evidently heading for a kitchen area. He noticed someone in the darkness, and uttered the words, "Cunis! Cunis!" at which point he was shot and killed. Although the popularity of the first story persists, and portrays Garrett in a better light, some historians contend that the second version is probably the accurate one. A markedly different theory, in which Garrett and his posse set a trap for McCarty, has also been suggested. Most recently explored in the 2004 Discovery Channel documentary, Billy the Kid, Unmasked, this version says that Garrett went to the bedroom of Pedro Maxwell's sister, Paulita, and bound and gagged her in her bed. When McCarty arrived, Garrett was waiting behind Paulita's bed and shot the kid, not with a revolver but a shotgun. Garrett allowed the kid's friends to take his body across the plaza to the carpenter's shop to give him a wake. The next morning, Justice of the Peace Milner Rudolph viewed the body and made out the death certificate, but Garrett rejected the first one and demanded another one be written more in his favor. The kid's body was then prepared for burial, and at noon was buried at the Fort Sumner Cemetery between his two friends, Tom Folliard and Charlie Boda. In his book, Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, Robert Utley told the story of Pat Garrett's book effort. In the weeks following Garrett's execution of the kid, he felt the need to tell his side of the story. Many people had begun to talk about the unfairness of the encounter, so Garrett called upon his friend, Marshall Ashmun, Ash, Upson, to ghostwrite a book with him. Upson was a roving journalist who had a gift for graphic prose. Their collaboration led to a book entitled The Authentic Life of Billy, the Kid, which was first published in April 1882. The book originally sold few copies. However, it eventually proved to be an important reference for historians who would later write about the kid's life.
Notoriety.
Like many gunfighters of the Old West, Billy the Kid enjoyed a reputation built partly on exaggerated accounts of his exploits. McCarty was credited with the killing of between 15 and 26 men, depending on varying sources. Wallace has speculated that the Dolan faction created the Kid's image to distract the public's attention from their activities and those of their influential supporters in Santa Fe, notably the regional political leader Thomas Benton Catron. The notoriety that McCarty gained during the Lincoln County War effectively doomed his appeals for amnesty. A number of the regulators faded away or secured amnesty, but McCarty could not accomplish either. His negotiations with Governor Lew Wallace, a famed Civil War general and author of the novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, for amnesty came to nothing. A string of negative newspaper editorials referred to him as Billy the Kid. When a reporter reminded Wallace that the kid was depending on the governor's intervention, the governor supposedly smiled and said, "Yes, but I can't see how a fellow like him can expect any clemency from me."
First-hand accounts of character.
Various accounts recorded by friends and acquaintances describe him as fun-loving and jolly, articulate in both his writing and his speech, and loyal to those for whom he cared. He was fluent in Spanish, popular with Latino girls, an accomplished dancer, and well-loved in the territory's Hispanic community. His many Hispanic friends did not view him as a ruthless killer but rather as a defender of the people who was forced to kill in self-defense, Wallace writes. In the time that the kid roamed the land he chided Hispanic villagers who were fearful of standing up to the big ranchers who stole their land, water, and way of life. Several surviving accounts portrayed Billy McCarty as friendly, fun-loving and loyal. Frank Coe, who rode as a regulator, recalled years after the kid's death. George Coe, a cousin to Frank who also served as a regulator, said, "Billy was a brave, resourceful and honest boy. He would have been a successful man under other circumstances. The kid was 1,000 times better and braver than any man hunting him, including Pat Garrett." Susan Maxween, the widow of Alexander Maxween, came to McCarty's defense in the years of his notoriety, saying, Contemporaries of McCarty often claimed that tales of his crimes were exaggerated or denied their veracity altogether. Louis Abraham, who befriended the kid in Silver City, denied the killing of the blacksmith attributed to Bonney there, saying, Delavina Maxwell, who was at the Maxwell farmhouse at the time of the kid's death, said, Garrett was afraid to go back in the room to make sure of whom he had shot. I went in and was the first to discover that they had killed my little boy. I hated those men and am glad that I lived long enough to see them all dead and buried.
Ferrotype.
One of the few remaining artifacts of McCarty's life is a 2x 3-inch ferrotype taken by an unknown photographer sometime in late 1879 or early 1880. It is the only image of McCarty that scholars agree is authentic. The ferrotype survived because after Billy's death, Dan Dedrick, one of Billy's Rustler friends, held on to the picture and passed it down in his family. The ferrotype appeared in several copied forms before the original was made public in the mid-1980s by Stephen and Art Upham, descendants of Dedrick. It was displayed for several years in the Lincoln County Heritage Trust Museum before it was withdrawn again. The ferrotype sold at auction on June 25, 2011, in a 3-day Western show. It was purchased for $2.3 million, some 6 times the estimate. It was the most expensive piece ever sold at Brian LaBelle's annual Old West Show and Auction, and the 7th most expensive photograph ever sold. The photograph of the kid, commonly known as the Upham tintype, after its longtime owner Frank Upham, was the subject of intense study by experts in the late 1980s. Their detailed findings were presented at a symposium held in 1989. The experts concluded that the Colt revolver carried by McCarty was probably not his primary weapon, since his holster is not the type normally associated with gunslingers. Rather, it is a common holster, with a safety strap across the top to keep the 6-shooter from bouncing out. McCarty's main weapon appears to be the Winchester carbine held in his hand in the ferrotype. In August 2013, a tintype photograph was released that appears to be of McCarty and his friend Dan Dedrick. Recently, the photo was forensically compared to the existing tintype and was proven to indeed be the infamous Outlaw, with Dedrick to his left.
Left-handed or right-handed?
It was widely assumed throughout much of the 20th century that Billy the Kid was left-handed. This perception was encouraged by the above-mentioned photograph of McCarty, in which he appears to be wearing a gun belt with a holster on his left side, but further examination revealed that as all Winchester Model 1873 rifles were made with a loading gate on the right side of the receiver, the left-handed photograph is in fact a mirror image. Indeed, the notion of a left-handed Billy became so entrenched that in 1958 a film biography of the Kid, starring Paul Newman, was titled The Left-Handed Gun. In 1954 Western historians James D. Horan and Paul San announced that McCarty was right-handed and carried his pistol on his right hip. More recently, in response to a story from The Guardian that used an uncorrected McCarty ferrotype, Clyde Jevons, a former curator of the National Film and Television Archive, cited their work and added, "A second look at the ferrotype confirms what Jevons wrote. The prong on the belt buckle points the wrong way, and the buttons on the kid's vest are on the left side, the side reserved for ladies' blouses. The convention for menswear is that buttons go down the right side." Wallace wrote in 2007 that McCarty was ambidextrous. This observation seems to be supported by contemporaneous newspaper accounts reporting that Billy the Kid could shoot handguns with his left hand as accurately as he does with his right, and that his aim with a revolver in each hand, shooting simultaneously, is unerring.
People who claim to be Billy the Kid.
Legends grew over time that Billy the Kid was not killed that night, but that Garrett, a known friend of the Kid's, may have staged it all so the Kid could escape the law, despite eyewitness accounts of his slaying. In 2004, researchers sought to exhume the remains of Catherine Antrim, McCarty's mother, so her DNA could be tested and compared with DNA to be taken from the body buried under the Kid's gravestone. Ultimately, the case was bogged down in the courts, much to the delight of New Mexico Governor Bill Richardson, who knows all too well the value of Billy as a cultural icon and a draw for tourists. Several men have claimed to be McCarty over the years, and at least two became notable because they were successful in persuading a small segment of the public.
Brushy Bill Roberts.
In 1949, a paralegal named William Morrison located a man in Central Texas known as Ollie Partridge Roberts, nicknamed Brushy Bill, who claimed to be Billy the Kid and challenged the popular account of McCarty as shot to death by Pat Garrett in 1881. Brushy Bill later claimed that Ollie Partridge Roberts was an assumed name which accounted for the discrepancies in birth dates and physical appearance between Ollie Roberts and Billy the Kid. Although his story was refuted by mainstream historians, the town of Hico, Texas, Brushy Bill's residence, has capitalized on the Kid's infamy by opening the Billy the Kid Museum. Brushy Bill's story was further promoted by the 1990 film Young Guns 2, as well as a 2011 episode of Brad Meltzer's Decoded on the History Channel. Robert Stack did a segment on Brushy Bill in early 1990 on the NBC television series Unsolved Mysteries.
John Miller.
Another individual who allegedly claimed to be Billy the Kid was John Miller, whose family supported his claim in 1938, sometime after Miller's death. Miller was buried at the state-owned Pioneers Home Cemetery in Prescott, Arizona. Tom Sullivan, a former sheriff of Lincoln County, and Steve Cedarwall, a former mayor of Capitan, disinterred the bones of John Miller in May 2005. Though Cedarwall and Sullivan believed the exhumation was allowed, official permission had not been given. DNA samples from the remains were sent to a lab in Dallas, Texas, to be compared with traces of blood obtained from a bench that was believed to be the one upon which McCarty's body was placed after he was shot to death. The two investigators had searched for McCarty's physical remains since 2003. They started in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and had eventually ended up in Arizona. To date, no DNA test results have been made public. As of 2008, a lawsuit is pending against officials in Lincoln County that would, if successful, publicize the results of those tests along with other evidence that Sullivan and Cedarwall collected.
Posthumous pardon considered.
In 2010, the governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, considered a posthumous pardon for McCarty, who had been convicted for killing Sheriff William Brady. The pardon was considered to be a follow-through on a purported promise made by then-Governor Lew Wallace in 1879. On December 31, 2010, on the last day of his term in office, Bill Richardson announced on Good Morning America his decision not to pardon McCarty. He cited historical ambiguity surrounding the conditions of Lew Wallace's pardon.
Grave marker theft and locations.
According to Garrett, McCarty was buried in Fort Sumner's old military cemetery the day after he was killed, between his fallen companions Tom Folliard and Charlie Boda. After Billy's burial, someone took a plain board, stenciled letters on it, and jammed it into the soft earth at the head of his grave to mark it. This marker remained at least until the early part of 1882 before it was stolen or shot to pieces. Pete Maxwell then placed the next marker and used a 4-foot-long, wooden slat removed from the parade ground picket fence near his home. A 1-foot length was cut off and hammered onto the longer piece to form a cross, and the words Billy the Kid, Bonney, July 14, 1881 were placed on the horizontal cross piece. After Maxwell sold the old fort to the New England Livestock Company, one of the board of directors, a fellow named Chauncey from Boston, that visited Fort Sumner in the late 1880s took the marker claiming he was taking it back east to a museum. It was never recovered. In 1889 and 1904 the Pecos River floods overtook the cemetery and all the markers were washed away. The latter flood inundated the cemetery under 4 feet of muddy water until the cemetery had no grave markers left of any kind. For over 2 decades Billy's grave remained unmarked. The exact location of Billy's grave in the small 1-acre cemetery is unknown, however, relying on residents who had once lived nearby to pick out the walls, corner, and cemetery entrance, they were able to approximate Billy's grave location. In 1932, Charles W. Full, the unofficial tour guide of the cemetery, spearheaded the drive to raise funds for a marker. Although the edges are damaged, this large white marker has never been stolen. It serves as a memorial monument noting 3 individuals buried in the cemetery: Tom Affiliate, Charlie Boda, and William H. Bonney. 8 years later, Warner Brothers used a Billy the Kid grave marker as a prop in the movie The Outlaw. James N. Warner of Salada, Colorado, donated this marker to the cemetery when it was no longer required for the movie. This individual grave marker was placed as a footstone with a pointed top. This marker was stolen and recovered twice. It was first stolen in August 1950, and not recovered until 25 years later, in May 1976, in a field on a ranch near Granbury, Texas. Local resident Joe Bolin brought it back, and it was ceremoniously reinstalled that June. It was stolen again in February 8, 1981, but recovered days later in Huntington Beach, California. New Mexico Governor Bruce King arranged for the sheriff of the county seat to fly to California to bring it back to Fort Sumner, where it was reinstalled in May 1981. A short time later, the village, which owned the cemetery at the time, erected a steel cage to protect the grave site, preserved the chipped-away white headstone, and placed Billy's individual footstone in shackles, to discourage further vandalism and theft. The cemetery is located 34 deg 24.253 feet N, 104 deg 11.593 feet W, about 3.5 miles, 5 kilometers, south of State Highway 60 on Route 212. The stolen tombstone became the inspiration for the world's richest tombstone race, held during Fort Sumner's Old Fort Days celebration every June. On June 16, 2012, a group of vandals entered the cage at night and tipped over the stone.
Selected references in popular culture.
Billy the Kid has been the subject and inspiration for many popular works, including
Literature.
The Story of the Outlaw, 1907, by Emerson Hough. This is a collection of stories of famous outlaws and badmen and includes a complete account of the events involving Billy the Kid. It reveals that he was the only one of many combatants of the Lincoln County War who was indicted and brought to trial. Frontier Fighter, 1934, a first-hand account of the Lincoln County War from George W. Coe. Billy the Kid, 1958, a serial poem by Jack Spicer. Billy the Kid was published in 1962 as an episode in the ongoing adventures of Lucky Luke by Goscinny and Morris. El Bandido Adolescent, The Teenage Outlaw, 1965, a biography written by Spanish author Ramon J. Sender. Lincoln County War, 1968, The Definitive History of the Lincoln County War, by Morris G. Fulton. The Collected Works of Billy the Kid, Left-Handed Poems, by Michael Ondarch. 1970 Governor General's award-winning biography in the form of experimental poetry, The Illegal Rebirth of Billy the Kid is a science fiction novel by Rebecca Orr, published in 1991. Anything for Billy is a 1988 novel by Larry McMurtry. Lucky Billy, a novel about Billy the Kid is a 2008 novel by John Vernon, a professor at Binghamton University. The novels Inferno and Escape from Hell by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle feature interactions between the novel's contemporary main characters traversing Dante's Inferno and Billy the Kid.
Film.
Billy the Kid, a 1911 silent film directed by Lawrence Trimble and starring Teft Johnson. All copies are believed to be lost. Billy the Kid, 1930 widescreen film directed by King Vidor and starring Johnny Mac Brown as Billy and Wallace Beery as Pat Garrett. Billy the Kid Returns, 1938, Roy Rogers plays a dual role, Billy the Kid and his dead ringer look-alike who shows up after the Kid has been shot by Pat Garrett. Billy the Kid, 1941 remake of the 1930 film, starring Robert Taylor and Brian Donlevy. Bob Steele and Buster Crabbe played Billy the Kid in a series of 42 Western films from 1940 through 1946, released by Poverty Row Studio Producers Distributing Corporation. Some of the titles include Blazing Frontier, The Renegade, Cattle Stampede, and Western Cyclone, 1943. In a 1952 film, Alan Rocky Lane goes after Billy the Kid's lost treasure, The Outlaw, Howard Hughes' 1943 motion picture starring Jack Beitel as Billy and featuring Jane Russell in her breakthrough role as the kid's fictional love interest, I Shot Billy the Kid, a 1950 film directed by William Burke and starring Don Red Barry as Billy, the Kid from Texas, 1950, starring Audie Murphy as Billy the Kid, The Law vs. Billy the Kid, 1954, Columbia Pictures Corporation, starring Scott Brady as the Kid, James Griffith as Pat Garrett, Bette St. John as Nita Maxwell, and Alan Hale, Jr. as Bob Ollinger, The Left-Handed Gun, Arthur Penn's 1958 motion picture based on a Gore Vidal teleplay, starring Paul Newman as Billy and John Diner as Garrett, The Boy from Oklahoma, 1954, with Tyler McDuff in the role of Billy the Kid. One-Eyed Jacks, 1961, is the only film directed by Marlon Brando, who also played its lead character, Rio. This story is from an adaptation by Rod Serling of a Charles Nider novelization of Billy the Kid's life, with a later revision by Sam Peckinpah among others. Billy the Kid vs. Dracula, 1966, directed by William B. Dean, as Count Dracula, played by John Carradine, traveling to the Old West, where he takes a shine to Billy's fiancée and tries to turn her into a vampire. Chuck Courtney co-stars as Billy, I'll Kill Him and Return Alone, a 1967 spaghetti western directed by Julio Bucks, starred Peter Lee Lawrence as Billy and Fausto Tozzi as Pat Garrett. Kaisam, 1970, set during the Lincoln County War, was directed by Andrew V. McLaughlin and stars Jeffrey Deuel as Billy and Glenn Corbett as Pat Garrett. Dirty Little Billy, 1972, set during Billy's early years as a criminal, starred Michael J. Pollard, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Sam Peckinpah's 1973 motion picture with Chris Christopherson as Billy, James Coburn as Pat Garrett, and with a soundtrack by Bob Dylan, who also appears in the movie, Young Guns. Christopher Kane's 1988 motion picture starring Emilio Estevez as Billy and Patrick Wayne as Pat Garrett, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, 1989, features Billy the Kid, played by Dan Schott, as the historical figure that Bill and Ted pick up in the Old West. Gore Vidal's Billy the Kid, Gore Vidal's 1989 film starring Val Kilmer as Billy and Duncan Regehr as Pat Garrett. Young Guns 2, Jeff Murphy's 1990 motion picture starring Emilio Estevez as Billy and William Peterson as Pat Garrett. Purgatory, Yuli Adel's 1999 made-for-TV movie starring Donnie Wahlberg as Deputy Glenn Billy the Kid. Requiem for Billy the Kid, Anne Fansilber's 2006 motion picture starring Chris Christopherson. Birth of a Legend, a 2011 film in two parts based on Frederick Nolan's book The Lincoln County War, a documentary history directed by Andrew Wilkinson.
Music.
Billy the Kid, a folk song in the public domain, was published in John A. Lomax and Alan Lomax's American Ballads and Folk Songs, and also their cowboy songs and other frontier ballads. Billy the Kid folk song sung by Woody Guthrie, recorded by Alan Lomax in 1940 for the Library of Congress, No. 3412B2, with a melody Guthrie later used for his song So Long, It's Been Good to Know You. He also recorded it in 1944 for Moash's Ash Folkways label, MA67, Aaron Copland's Billy the Kid, a ballet that premiered in 1938. On his album Piano Man, 1973, Billy Joel performs a song titled The Ballad of Billy the Kid, which tells a fictionalized version of the outlaw's life. Bob Dylan's album Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, soundtrack of the 1973 film by Sam Peckinpah. John Bon Jovi's album Blaze of Glory, used as part of the soundtrack for Young Guns 2, and featured the song Billy Get Your Gun. Marty Robbins' song Billy the Kid from the album Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs Volume 3. Awaikuda recorded the folk song Billy the Kid, on the album Into the Purple Valley, with his own melody and instrumental. It was also on Awaikuda Classics Volume 2. Tom Petty wrote the song Billy the Kid, released on his 1999 album Echo. Another Billy the Kid, was written by Robert W. Marr in 2010 when New Mexico Governor, Bill Richardson talked of pardoning the outlaw. The song has the line, with a slap in the face to those who had died. To hell with the death and the tears that were cried. Dire Frampton's Billy the Kid. On the 2011 album Red, Charlie Daniels recorded the song Billy the Kid on his 1976 album High Lonesome. Chris Ledoux also covered the song on his album Haywire. Joe Ely recorded the song Me and Billy the Kid on his 1987 album Lord of the Highway. Planet of Zeus recorded the song Woke Up Dead, William H Bonney, on their 2008 album 11 The Hard Way.
Stage.
Joseph Santley's 1906 Broadway play, co-written by Santley, in which he also starred. Michael McClure's 1965 play The Beard recounts a fictional meeting between Billy the Kid and Jean Harlow. Michael Ondaatje's 1973 play, The Collected Works of Billy the Kid.
Television and radio.
The Gunsmoke radio show had an episode titled Billy the Kid, broadcast on April 2, 1952. It purports to tell of Billy the Kid's first murder as a runaway boy and credits Matt Dillon with giving him the Billy the Kid moniker. Richard Jekyll played the Kid in a 1954 episode of the syndicated television series Stories of the Century. The NBC series The Tall Man ran from 1960 to 1962, starring Clu Gulager as Billy and Barry Sullivan as Pat Garrett. The 2004 Discovery Channel Quest, Billy the Kid, Unmasked, investigated the life and death of Billy the Kid through forensic science. American Experience, Billy the Kid, aired on PBS January 9, 2012.